Hi everyone. So it looks like Donald Trump has won the election. It was a huge win for these betting markets like Polymarket. I mean, this seemed to be much more accurate than the polls. The leading polls had it 50-50. You think about Nate Silver, who was one of the most prominent pollsters, said he ran a simulation thousands and thousands of times and came up exactly 50-50. Everybody was hedging their bets. But in reality, it's a landslide and a significant shift towards Trump, which has pretty big investment implications because it's going to be a very different world with Trump, his vice president, Elon Musk in government running Department of Governmental Efficiency. It's a very different world with them in charge than it was with Biden and Kamala. So let's try and think through some of the obvious investment consequences. First of all, it's interesting how this was such a clear trend. I think next election, I'm going to use one of my trend models on this because you can see it broke towards Trump, but then never really gave back. There was plenty of alpha there, but that's a tiny $100 wager that I will make next time. One of the interesting things is they're talking about doing a big cut in the size of government. And the reason that's interesting is in 2022, there was a huge contraction in one of the most vibrant sectors in the United States, but that didn't translate to a recession. I mean, there were 2 quarters of slightly negative growth, but it was marginal and quickly recovered, long before the tech sector recovered, actually. And why was that? The real reason was government spending, and we can see that in the numbers afterwards. So it's very hard to predict these things, but once the numbers come in, it's easier to see what actually happened. And really, it was massive government spending that propped everything up. You can see here from the St. Louis Fed, there was this obviously a huge deficit in COVID, but never really recovered. And putting aside questions over sustainability, obviously interest is a huge component of that now. What it really did was provide massive excess demand. So you're talking about $1.8 trillion of demand in the United States that otherwise wouldn't be there. And there's actually something similar going on in Australia, where you can see all the GDP growth at the moment is coming from the government sector, particularly when you include the health services and NDIS related spending. All the growth that's happened has actually happened through the government. Now, why is that interesting? Why is that relevant now? It's because they're looking at cutting. Now, if they're cutting, that could actually shrink US GDP. If, as Elon Musk suggests, he cuts 30% of government employees, which, by the way, I'm sure is absolutely possible and most certainly likely to be a good thing, that'll release a huge amount of talent and a huge amount of people onto the job market who'll have to find more productive things to do rather than regulate others. That's generally a good thing. And historically, waves of deregulation have involved very vibrant markets, very good time to be in business, very low unemployment rates. But in the short term, that will lead to a higher unemployment rate and potentially shrinking GDP. There's a good example of that, and that's Argentina, where Milei has gone in and slashed government departments. And this is their GDP growth. You can see that they've actually shrunk GDP over this period. Now, there's been other benefits. So you can see here the inflation rate hit over 200% and it's actually shrinking rapidly. The monthly inflation is only 3.5% now, apparently. And actually, the unemployment rate hasn't been so bad. Small rise in unemployment, most likely from the sacking of those officials. But, by other measures, Argentina is doing exceptionally well, and they're finally getting inflation under control as well. In the United States, if Elon Musk does cut 30% and I think the government is now, over 50% or something of government spending, that could potentially cause a contraction in GDP. Now, there's plenty who would make the argument that's a good thing. I'm certainly one of them, but it's going to be one of those things where it's very rare that you get big cuts in government like that. It'd be a huge shock to the system to have this 1.8 trillion go to zero or even a surplus. We'll just have to see how that plays out. There's other implications. So the big tech, Lena Khan, who's actually 35, I didn't realize how young she was. She's chair of the Federal Trade Commission, appointed by Biden, and has obviously cracked down very hard on big tech M&A, doing some very strange things, blocking acquisitions. That's been terrible for the VC sector, actually, because by blocking big tech companies from acquiring even small and modestly sized companies, have really choked off one of the very few exit opportunities. The other exit opportunity, of course, is the IPO market, and that's also been shut. So it's quite likely that both of those reopen, actually, that supportive market policies help reopen the IPO market, and perhaps a friendlier regulator would allow some of those takeovers, which would in turn recycle capital and lead to more of a boom. So that's all pretty welcome, I would say. There's obvious winners and losers. For example, Enphase, people who sell solar equipment, not a great time to be in business. Subsidies likely to go down, less environmental regulation, less environmental support. Interestingly, their partner was SolarEdge, and at some point this thing completely collapsed. It wasn't even on my watch list anymore, but look at that. It's been a huge move up and down for this company, even by the standards of the last 5, 6, 7 years. This was considered, an institutional company. It's $1 billion market cap, losing $500 million. So when you see this, you can be certain that the value cuts in below the value of the equity into the debt. So this $1 billion, it's almost like an option. Will the company turn around? Will the equity stub be worth something? Will that value that's below the debt, rise back above? So these are clear losers. But funnily enough, on the energy space, Elon Musk has aligned himself with Trump in a way that is almost unprecedented for a business person. I can't think of anything similar. It'll be interesting to see how serious he is about going into government and making those big cuts. But this is good news for his companies. I mean, they're up another 12% in the free market. The Democrats were threatening to cancel his government contracts and do everything they could. They're investigating him across all kinds of different avenues. This is one of the summaries that was on Twitter of all the different investigations that different departments are doing. Well, Elon Musk is now best buddies with the president. So the president's going to appoint leaders of all of these departments and agencies, and you can be sure that these arrows are going to basically be reversed. The people that are investigating him on extremely frivolous reasons themselves are going to be looking for a job now. But if you think about why on earth are they attacking SpaceX as much as they were when SpaceX was really the only way that the United States can get to space at the moment. So it's a huge win for that. I mean, SpaceX, imagine having some stock in that privately. They've got the only satellite network of its scale and ability and can just pump out more and more satellites. They will be the global information network. Elon Musk is going to end up with both Twitter and the internet rails with satellites. He's going to make all the investment that's been made terrestrially on the ground obsolete, including, of course, our own national broadband network in Australia. SpaceX will already be faster everywhere except perhaps in the middle of the largest cities where there's bandwidth limits. But even those are going to be, they're putting up satellites all the time. So that network is getting better and better and better. And in many parts of the world, it's oversubscribed. So that is going to be a phenomenally profitable business, perhaps one of the world's biggest, perhaps the world's biggest, depending on how big space economy actually gets. Might even be worth trying to get our hands on some of that privately. But it's not something we can do in our main fund. I think the other winners and losers, less clear. It was interesting to see that US yields rose. So this triggers a rise in yields, so that could dampen any enthusiasm. But there's also no doubt that this is going to be a market-friendly, business-friendly government, and that is going to overweigh most things, I think. It'll be interesting to go through some of the recent results. So let's start with Amazon, because they're there. I mean, this was a great result for them. Net sales were up 11%, still predominantly American and AWS. Operating income was up 56%. Operating income trailing 12 months up 130%. And net income after tax up 55%. This is all great, but you might remember that result they had in 2022, where they had this horrific net income loss. And so really this has been a recovery, but it hasn't grown so much from the prior peak. Still, it's impressive. It's hard not to be extremely impressed by that. In terms of what was worth highlighting, I thought the growth in advertising was interesting. So $14 billion of revenue in the quarter, 90% year over year. Amazon really is the main competitor to Google in search, and one of the main competitors to Meta and Google in advertising as well. Remember, when you go to Amazon and you search for something, that's extremely targeted. So most of Google's searches are not related to e-commerce. Things like booking flights, buying cars, they're the clicks that are most valuable. Googling something historical or mathematical or to do with education, that doesn't really generate any revenue at all. But on those really high value searches, Amazon is exceptionally good. So that's 14 billion. Analyze that, it's almost 60 billion. And I think the advertising market is not actually that big. You know what? Let's have a look. Flexity's thinking away. You can actually see it go through. Find Amazon market share, determine the size of US advertising market. 11.8% in 2022. Google's share of US net digital advertising, 27. So expected to reach just under 400 billion, and their run rate is 60 billion, so about 15%. And they're saying that Google's share of US is 27%. So it's a huge business that Amazon has created. So I think that was one of the strongest results. And to check in on their market cap, the market cap is 2 trillion. There are other little tidbits from the call. So CapEx is really interesting because obviously we've gone very big on semiconductors, and it helped us to like market leading returns in the first half of the year, but that sector has been down in the second half so far. So why are we still doing it? And one of the reasons is that we keep seeing these CapEx statements. So they expect to spend 75 billion alone on CapEx, more of that in 2025, majority of that in AWS, and the increase is driven by generative AI. The AI business is a multi-billion-dollar business. It's growing triple-digit percentages year over year and 3 times faster at its stage of evolution than AWS did. So the people that actually built AWS are now building another business. Their AI business is growing 3 times faster. It's also interesting that I said these are long-term, multi-year life assets. Now, this was interesting because everyone's worried about NVIDIA chips being only useful for a year before the next generation comes out and makes them obsolete or certainly higher cost. They are right. Data centers, probably a lot of it, the cooling systems, the power systems, probably are useful for extended periods of time. I think 20 to 30 is probably an exaggeration. I think that's the significant CapEx investment in a data center over 20 or 30 years to keep it working and valuable. But yeah, again, you get these comments, unusually large, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity. And once in a lifetime opportunity is quite meaningful coming from Amazon, because you could argue that they seize the once in a lifetime opportunity of the internet perhaps better than anyone, really, with the possible exception of Google. The other thing that's interesting is the demand is generally pretty forecast. So when they say people aren't showing over 30,000 chips in a day, what they're saying is that people are planning their demand in their data centers and their chip purchase a year plus in advance. So you have a very good idea it's certainly in the midterm what demand will be. And I thought it was also interesting to see there's 500 million Alexa devices around the world with active endpoints. What's going to happen with AI is each of these companies are going to have their own set of data, and it's their own set of data that's going to drive their competitive advantage and certainly stop people without these massive trillion-dollar internet businesses coming up and competing. So what does Amazon have? Amazon's data is everything anybody's ever said to Alexa, for example. Any search that anybody's put into Amazon, what they ended up buying, all that kind of stuff is data that they can use that the other big tech companies won't have access to. The other thing was interesting was this comment on retail business. So as they define it, and obviously they actually have extremely high market share, but they're trying to say that their market share is as low as possible to keep the regulators off their back and to keep investors excited. So by their numbers, they say they're only about 1% market share of global retail. 80 to 85% of that is in physical stores, and they think that will flip. There's plenty of opportunity there. And it's hard to disagree with that. So that was an interesting few comments on Amazon. I thought that was a strong report. You can see a big turnaround in profit. You can see what they're doing in AI. There's nothing there to suggest that CapEx is going to go down. If anything, that 75 billion is extremely striking. That's an enormous amount. Let's move on to one of the other ones. Microsoft, pretty solid, hard to beat, 16% on 200 billion plus of revenue. This is one of the monsters. I was trying to find the exact number users of Office 365 because I saw it estimated at 500 million. I think it's a bit hard because some people are using old versions of Office. So I've seen estimates at 400 mil, 365 mil for last year. Maybe they'll probably cross 500 mil users if you count everybody. And maybe that's where they'll be next year. But that's kind of like Amazon. It's a lot, but it's not a lot. There are really only 500 million people in the world using Office. You'd think it'd actually be higher. And it certainly could go higher with time. You could argue that could be 1.5, 2 bill, like a significant portion. Microsoft has not been a strong performer lately. It's only up 9% year to date. But, it's a $3 trillion business. It's going to be hard to move the needle. Forward P of 27 as well. It's fully priced for the opportunity. Ultimately, investment is driven by rates of return. So no matter how good a business is, when valuations get too high, it really does impact long-term returns. But I'd say that this premium is probably justified. And there are huge funds and huge allocations that will just keep going into it, including, of course, them buying back their own stock. To highlight a few things, cloud was 22% growth, slower elsewhere. Azure 34%, Xbox content and services 61%. And when you actually look at the financials of these companies and compare them to more junior companies, it's really striking how profitable they really are. 65 billion of revenue for 2023, of which 24 billion was after-tax income. That is a wild number. When you look at smaller companies, their results are nothing like that. And then we can go to the cash flow. You can see it's 34 billion of cash from ops. Of that, 2.8 billion was stock comp. So this is interesting because I'm going to do a series of these and do a number of different companies and show you how I'm looking at them. This is completely flipped on smaller companies, which is why software businesses have performed so poorly. 34 billion of cash from ops, 2.8 billion stock-based comp. It's less than 10% of their cash from operations is stock-based comp. And actually, they're buying more of that in stock. So you can see here, $9.7 billion of capital return to shareholders in the quarter. So 4.1 billion of stock purchased that quarter. So 16 billion of Microsoft is being bought at an annualized rate. Really impressive. Let's go to the earnings call and see if there's anything interesting we could pull up. So Microsoft Cloud, we talked about that. AI business on track, annual run rate of 10 billion next quarter. So we saw that their quarterly revenue is 65. So multiply that by 4, say 260, I guess. And 10 billion of that is AI. Now, on one hand, 2.5 billion of 65 is not a huge amount, 10 billion of 260, but they match what Amazon says. This is the fastest business in their history to reach this milestone. So they are seeing those signs, which is why the investment is still so large. You can see these growth numbers. They're highlighting some customers. Copilot Enterprise customers increased 55% quarter over quarter. So that's quarter over quarter, that's 3 months. So this thing is certainly growing. 70% of the Fortune 500 use Microsoft 365 Copilot. Customers continue to adopt it at a faster rate than new Microsoft 365 suite. So you are seeing that result. If the CapEx is justified by the revenues, this is what it would look like. It would look like these businesses growing faster than any other business. And that is exactly what you're seeing here. Video up 6% quarter over quarter on LinkedIn. It's interesting. I'll show you Meta's results as well. It does seem like the AI is improving engagement in all their apps. I certainly found that with Twitter. I find the apps like much more addictive than they used to be. So Morgan Stanley, most exciting period of software I've seen in 25 years, including SaaS and all these other periods. Comments on the OpenAI partnership. So they took a bet on them 4 or 5 years ago. World-class infrastructure. They innovated the model layer, post-training layer, and they've come out with things like GitHub Copilot. Ultimately, they're the ones with the cards. These other comments are interesting. If you take a business, this is what Satya says. If you take a business process like forecasting, what was it like pre-email in Excel and post-email in Excel? I find that fascinating. How do people actually do business like in the pen and paper era? That's how these like clerks. I don't even know how to say that word. It's so rare. You must have had so many people adding up columns and printing things on typewriters. And before that, summing things up using handwriting. It's bizarre. But this is going to be one of those periods. I'm personally using it every day. I'm going to use it to edit this. I'm going to use it to get the transcript, the notes. In the meetings that I take, I usually have an AI note taker. It summarizes everything. So that was Microsoft. What do you think about it overall? In line. I think it's the kind of result that gets you a P of, high 20s, low 30s. I think this is so largely owned now. The big move was up. That was the dip in 2022 if you wanted to take a big stake in Microsoft. I don't think the outsized returns will come. But, for most people, 10 to 15%, you'll probably get that here. And in fact, that is what it's done the year to date, 9.4%. Let's shift to Google. So Google grew a bit faster, 15%. Now, the interesting thing about Google, and I'll just quickly pull it up. I use FinViz, by the way, because it's by far the fastest app, as you can see. It's up 21%, so outperforming Microsoft, but a much lower P, forward P of 19 and 22. So a third lower in valuation and high growth, 15 to 16%. They were the winner in cloud revenue this quarter, 35%. So a huge increase. Operating income increased 34%. But you can see this 4.5 percentage point operating margin expansion. Net income increased 34%, EPS 37%. This is a wild thing because everyone's challenging them. I mean, on this video, I've been using Perplexity. We talked about how Amazon's got a huge market share in both advertising and obviously the highest margin clicks when people actually have that purchasing intent. They really want to buy something. Google is coming out with 34%, 37% EPS growth. It's impressive. They are taking huge risks. So they are kind of infusing DEI and all that kind of stuff through all their products. So if you search for anything political, often anything historical, you have to be very careful because there will be a lens that will increase in accuracy. And also it's been well established and repeated that once you add all these kinds of DI things into the models, they actually get worse. So if you want them to give good answers across the board, they kind of get dumber once you start asking them to do dumb things, which is really interesting in itself. So there's risks for Google. There's huge risks at the moment. Where will they be in the age of agents? If hotels, flights, bookings are the highest value searches and clicks, what happens when you have an agent going out and scouring and booking the best flight? That's not clear. It could be Google that wins it. It could be a Google model. It could be done on their infrastructure. It could be done using their search engine APIs, their APIs. It could easily be them, but it might not. So they have everything to play for here. But I guess a really strong result, 26 billion of net income. Wild. Again, note how good these income statements are. Just put these in the memory hole for when we look at something else. So 253 bill of revenue for year to date, so 9 months, 73.5 bill of after-tax income. Now, most growth companies are growing slower than 16%, certainly slower than the 37% EPS growth. They can't post any numbers of these, even when they have adjusted EBITDA. This is after-tax income that goes directly into shareholders. It's effectively value creation in the market in its rawest form. Now, in the quarter, let's do it quarterly. So 30 billion of operating cash flow. How much of that was stock comp? 5 billion. So not a huge amount. Less than 20% of their operating cash flow was stock-based comp. And when you go to buybacks, 15 billion. No dividends for this one in the quarter, but 15 billion of quarterly stock. So again, 60 billion. Why is the Nasdaq so relentless? Why is it so good on a risk-adjusted basis? Why does it sell off less? It's not just that these companies are monsters. It's that there's this enormous bid. 60 billion from this company, 50 billion from another, 50 billion from another, just constantly in the market, propping it up, buying it regardless of whether it's up, down, or sideways. That's really one of the reasons why it's so big. And that dynamic is absent in, for example, the ASX. In the ASX, you don't have that. You have these lumpy dividend payments because our tax system is structured for that. But you don't have that consistent daily bid. And you can really feel it in the markets. You can really feel it. Like dips get bought much more aggressively in these companies. They don't sell as much. And it's not just because they're robust, though that is part of it. On to their earnings fall. So what was interesting? The results were spectacular. The world's first agreement to purchase nuclear energy from SMRs, which enable 500 megawatts of carbon-free power. The other thing that's interesting here is that in 18 months, they reduced the cost of their queries by 90%, and that's going to continue. So one of the themes in AI is the cost to process requests is dramatically falling. Google is also unique in actually having well-advanced TPUs, competitors to GPU. Obviously, no one else can really use them, as in the other big tech companies. They use them for their own training, and then they also lease out the excess capacity. So those investments have paid off exceptionally because it'll take years for Microsoft and Amazon's chips to catch up. It's also a nice little congratulations to their former employees that have won the Nobel Prize in chemistry of all things on AlphaFold. I remember when I was 16, chemistry tutor telling me that the number one thing in biochemistry was to predict protein 3D structure, the geometry of proteins from their 2D line of codes of A, G, C's, and T's. And that's now been done. How old am I? 20 years later. He calls out NotebookLM, which is very good. I recommend you try it. Today, more than a quarter of all new code at Google is generated by AI. The beauty of Google is they can just roll this stuff out to 1 billion users. 1 billion users on a monthly basis. They can just put that in their search and start giving AI answers. And then obviously the unique data that Google has, we talk about the unique data that Amazon has, Microsoft obviously has unique data, Facebook has Instagram and all that. Google has this search data and the use in email from Gmail and YouTube. They've got a lot to work with here. YouTube has now surpassed 50 billion of annualized revenue, which is a monster. Another thing that needs to be discussed is Waymo. So they are now winning. Obviously, it seems like you can't rule out Elon Musk, but they're doing 1 million fully autonomous, 150,000 paid rides. First time any autonomous vehicle company has reached this kind of mainstream use. That does have to be congratulated. You've got a $2 trillion company. Let's say they dominated Uber, 156 billion. It might move the needle for them, but not entirely. There's those massive share purchases and dividend payments, 70 billion over the last 12 months. Let's look at CapEx, because that's relevant to our semiconductor stuff. 13 billion in CapEx across the company. So it is going up. There was a really good question from Wells Fargo. It was basically like, why didn't you set up, instead of trying to put it all in Google, why don't you have a more traditional search engine and then a more agent-like answers engine, more like a ChatGPT? I mean, Google obviously has Gemini, but their strategy really seems to be to merge the two. So, and integrate AI into all of your search. I think the reality is, I'm sure they would love to have 1 billion monthly users checking into an app that they developed, but really the users are all on the Google search. So if they're serious about this, if they want to get that feedback engine going to be constantly improving their AI and get that data and really try and be the best AI company, they've got to do it with the larger user base, which I think is the real answer here. They have experimented a little bit, but it's Google. They have to use the assets at their disposal to get the data to improve their products. So I think that's basically what it's doing. And that's Google. I might actually wrap it up there. Trump's about to declare victory in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. As I'm looking now, S&P 500's up 2.2%. The Nasdaq's up 1.85%. Small caps are up 5.66%. So huge moves in the markets. I covered 3 big tech companies. The key takeaways are big CapEx coming, more next year, most of that going to data centers, most of the data centers going to the GPUs, with the rest going to kind of infrastructure, related infrastructure. Semiconductors have sold off significantly. I really think there's an opportunity here. We're using a risk model-based approach. You can see here it's 17% down. Amidst all this CapEx and this acceleration that's coming, that is going to land on this sector. So we're going to keep this as one of our main focuses. That is one of the broad conclusions we have from big tech. When we think about the impact of the election on the tech sector, focusing on big tech, it will probably ease the way for acquisitions of smaller companies. It should be said that Trump is bold enough to do something like break up Google if he thought it was in the national interest, if he thought there was benefit. I think that's something that would be bad for Google executives at the very highest level, because they'll then no longer be controlling all these companies. For whoever ends up running all the different entities, if it is split up, it's a huge win. Then our CEOs of major tech companies, their pay will increase. For shareholders, this will probably work. The higher growing parts will get massive multiples. The steadier, rock solid dividend payers, share buybackers will continue doing that and will find their own set of investors. So it's pretty positive. On the semiconductors, Trump is pretty serious about national security. He's very serious about things being made in the United States. So you can expect that any efforts to onboard US chip making will be accelerated with him in charge. And also, it'll be interesting to see what that does to the geopolitical sector. I can see that Chinese equities are selling off. I think the impacts of all this stuff is TBD. I don't think we're there yet. I think we need a bit more time. Meta's reported results in a couple of our companies by the end of this week. So the next update, I'll do a few more of these. If you have any feedback on this, please let me know. It'd be super helpful to know what you think, how we can improve these things. And thanks so much for listening in. If this is interesting, hit the subscribe button, because I'll be posting more of these and you can stay up to date. I hope you found that interesting, and I will wrap it up there. Thanks so much.